My family life wasn't the best, but it was better than most, even though my mother died when I was young and my father was a workaholic. With all that said, I live in a small town that has a large forest that surrounds a national park that is quite popular with tourists. Walking through the forest was the quickest way to get from home to school and vice versa, as it was a single path, so it wasn't too hard to travel down even at night. However, one night that always stays with me, I was walking down the path through the forest heading home from a study session at school. Due to my grades not being the best, and with the threat of summer school, I knew I had to knuckle down or spend my summer at school when I would rather be at home. Walking down the path like I always do, day in, day out, I noticed that something wasn't quite right. Halfway down the path, I felt like something was watching me, even knowing that there was no big predators or even small predators around. I quickened my pace, moving down the path. However, the feeling increases as footsteps could be heard behind me. As I spin around, I notice a young deer walking along the path behind me. I chuckle to myself for being silly and carry on walking. But once I continue walking, the feeling of being watched intensifies as I hear whispering coming from behind me in voices that could not be understood. In my mind, I place it down to being tourists hiking in the surrounding areas to keep my mind stable instead of panicking. Nearing the end of the trail, the sun lowered in the sky, and I noticed shifting shadows hiding in the corners of my vision, reaching and groaning for warmth of the living. After leaving the forest, the feeling of being hunted slowly melted away, as the walk home from the forest was not a long one, but it was still a fair distance. Making it home, locking my door as I noticed my father's boots laid on the ground, as I finally have the feeling of a false safety, as I have made it home and in the company of my father. I slowly made it into the living room and noticed my father passed out with an empty whiskey bottle in one hand and in the other a picture of my mother. My father always drank a lot, but after my mother's death it became a coping mechanism, as he still hasn't got over her death. My mother died in our old home from a home invasion that went wrong while my father was out on a business trip a few towns over. I was at school and was picked up by my grandmother, who had sadly passed away. My mother was beautiful, but now she was gone and all I was left with was my father. Passing the window, the feeling of being watched again radiated through my body once more, and made me look like I was a rabbit in the eyes of a wolf. Turning to look out of the window, I couldn't see anything due to being pitch black, and the sun has already set over the hills. Turning back from the window, I draw the curtain and clean up the living room as my father keeps muttering woefully as I cover him up with a blanket and slowly head to my room. But the feeling of being stalked never left me. Closing my door, I begin to review my study notes from the day. However, I hear a sound of movement from my window. Being the curious sort, looking out of my window, I noticed a shadowy figure standing at the back of my shed that sits at the boundary of the forest. Watching it carefully, I couldn't see any noticeable figures, just a black mass slowly moving side to side. Watching the mass, I felt an intense feeling of fear, so I instinctively closed the blinds and moved away from the window. Slowly calming down, I climbed into bed and tried to sleep. Sleeping soundly, I began to dream. During my dream, I was slowly walking in the forest as I began to hear a beautiful, familiar sound. That sound was from a woman singing. Drawing closer to the sound, I noticed a figure stood in the clearing of the woods and came to realize that figure was no one other than my mother. Slowly dancing and singing, she smiled and waved at me as the feeling of joy radiated over me, But once she stopped singing and slowly tried to speak, however, no sound came out. As I slowly reached her, she vanished into thin air as a smell of rotting and decay ravaged the area, as something and everything went black, and I closed my eyes in fear. Within moments I was hit with a feeling of intense dread until a shearing pain struck my back. As I tried to scream, no sound would come out. I noticed a figure standing in front of me. It laughed and cackled as it slowly moved around me, as I felt sharp objects slowly wrapping and coiling around my throat. Within seconds I woke up screaming and covered in hot beads of sweat. I looked over at my clock and I noticed that I haven't even been asleep for a single hour, as I then lay back down and tried to sleep, but without much luck. The next day at school, my friends and teachers noticed that I didn't sleep much, as my eyes were like a panda's, with dark circles around them, and one of my teachers tried to attempt to ask me if I'm okay, but in my mind, I was fine, there was nothing wrong, and I ignored him. Throughout the day, I kept having a feeling that I was being watched. Each and every step, each and every action was being monitored by an unseen force. Once the school day was over, I began my usual walk home, as tiredness slowly began to affect me as I yawned and rubbed my eyes. Closing my eyes for a single moment, I could hear the familiar call ring out as my attention was ripped back from my sleepy state. Looking around to try and find the sound, I caught a glimpse of a shadowy figure heading into a nearby grove. My feet began to move on their own. Walking a short while only catches glimpses, going through different clearings and groves until I reached the grove from my dreams. I suddenly stopped and seemed to regain my senses. I look around and notice that the sun has already begun to lower behind the trees, giving the clearing an eerie sense of foreboding and dread. Looking around, the feeling of dread intensifies as it reaches into my heart and slowly begins to tug at my nerves as my heart begins to beat heavily, as I hear a voice radiate from the shadows around me. "You came? Good. We hunger." The voice rattles the surroundings, as it started off as a familiar voice and then turned into a multitude of voices all screaming at once. I stood there and began to see the figure slowly coming closer as the image of my mother approached me. The figure walked slowly, but each step it began to slowly show the decay, and also the parts of her clothing tore and dropped to the floor. My heart raced as seeing the image of my mother slowly approaching, decaying like an undead creature, nearly made my heart stop in fear, as all I could do was look for an exit. As I slowly stepped back and tripped over a root, I collapsed to the ground and blacked out as I hit my head on the ground. Within moments I was awoke and was in the arms of a police officer who had told me that they found me at the edge of the path, collapsed on the ground as I look around in near terror. As I noticed, it was now dark and the terrifying figure and vestige had vanished. After a few days of sleepless nights, my health had dropped harshly because each time I slept, all I could do was seeing my mother's decaying face in my mind, and that affected my relationships with my friends and family. The relationship with my friends had worsened as I keep passing up meetings and parties as I just couldn't handle social situations. I even tried to talk to my father about it, but he just exploded on me and rejected me as an insane child. Night after night I could hear whatever it was in the darkness of the forest calling out to me, wanting me to go out to it and meet it. I must admit, its promise of peace and paradise seems great, but at what cost? Last night's dream was terrible, as each time I closed my eyes, I found myself back at that clearing, surrounded by people whom I knew. They were all calling me crazy and insane, saying that I should just end it and accept it. Each time I try to run, my body freezes up as the figure of my mother appears and screams at me in a tone that could not be understood. But the worst part of it was when I awoke, and for the first time I saw my mother in my room, floating above my bed, with her body decayed and her clothes torn apart by the ravages of time. She finally spoke. "Help me, son. You must stop it. Help me." With that said, I passed out and awoke a few hours later with no sign of my mother in sight. Knowing what I had to do, I had to face this thing. If I didn't, there was no escaping these nightmares. So tonight, I am going out to that clearing and I am going to face this thing. To everyone reading this, it comes at night.